When Paul and his companions had passed through Amphipolis and Apollonia, they came to Thessalonica, where there was a Jewish synagogue. As was his custom, Paul went into the synagogue, and on 3 Sabbath days he reasoned with them from the Scriptures, explaining and proving that the Messiah had to suffer and rise from the dead. This Jesus I am proclaiming to you is the Messiah, he said. Some of the Jews were persuaded and joined Paul and Silas, as did a large number of God-fearing Greeks and quite a few prominent women. But other Jews were jealous, so they rounded up some bad characters from the marketplace, formed a mob, and started to riot in the city. They rushed to Jason's house in search of Paul and Silas in order to bring them out to the crowd. But when they did not find them, they dragged Jason and some other believers before the city officials, shouting, "These men who have caused trouble all over the world have now come here, and Jason has welcomed them into his house. They are all defying Caesar's decrees, saying there is another king, one called Jesus." When they heard this, the crowd and the city officials were thrown into turmoil. Then they made Jason and the others post bond and let them go.
Thank you, Tori. Now, the year was 1955. Ella Fitzgerald had been singing jazz professionally for 20 years, but was still largely unheard of in society. But knowing that it would propel her career, she desperately tried to persuade the Macombo Club to let her sing. It was a renowned club at the time, most renowned club of jazz music. But the manager would always turn her down, thinking that if he let Ella Fitzgerald play, it would possibly damage the club's reputation. So one night, Ella was confiding in one of her close friends, a woman by the name of Marilyn Monroe. You may have heard of her. She was shocked, and she immediately rang the manager of the club and asked him to book Ella. What do you think the manager of the club said? Well, still he refused. So Marilyn Monroe used her powers of persuasion. She made the deal with the manager that if she sat on the front row every night that Ella Fitzgerald was playing, then the press would go wild and it would get him so much publicity. So the manager agreed, and Marilyn Monroe, she kept up her end of the deal. She sat in the front row every night, and the press indeed went wild. And Ella Fitzgerald's career reached the heights that her voice deserved. I don't think any of us have been in that position, have we? But I'm sure we've all had to face the challenge of having to persuade someone to do something, to perhaps change the way that they were acting or behaving beforehand. Maybe we've had to try and persuade a friend to help us with a project that we're undertaking that we need an extra pair of hands for. We might have a child that we need to persuade in order to brush their teeth. Or maybe we've had to persuade a boss and convince a boss that we actually deserve a raise or a promotion. Persuading people is part of everyday life at times, isn't it? Now, as Christians, we have the challenge of having to persuade people that people who don't follow Jesus, that he really is worth giving their lives to. And today, as we see in this passage, Paul and his team had to do that in the town of Thessalonica. That was a town back then that was around about the size of Cumbrae. So that gives us a helpful gauge of the size of town we're dealing with. And we're going to learn from their persuasion about how we are also to persuade others to become his followers. But you might not be a Christian. Maybe you're not sure if you're a Christian. Maybe you're just figuring this whole thing out and starting to get ideas for it. And if so, then as you hear this, my hope for you is that you too will be persuaded to follow Jesus. Now, there's much more that could be said than merely what I say today. But maybe today we'll give you just what you needed to make you decide that it really is worth giving your life to Jesus. But what we're going to see, first of all, is that as we persuade people, we must explain the message. It is vital that we live our lives in such a way that we are showing Jesus to the people around us in the way that we live our lives. Absolutely. That has to be part of it. But at some point, we have to get to the message that we need to share. It's a message that needs explaining. And even though most of us, I would imagine, feel inadequate at doing this, I'm absolutely convinced that every Christian is capable of saying something that explains the message of Jesus to someone who isn't yet a Christian. Now, here are some pointers from this true story about how we can do that. First is that it must be from the Bible. From the Bible. Now, right at the end of verse 2 is where it says this about Paul. He reasoned with them from the scriptures, from the Bible as they had it in that time, the first half of the Bible. Now, this is not just because Paul was talking to Jewish people that he spoke from the Bible and people who were sympathetic to the Jewish faith as well. Obviously, they accepted the Old Testament, and so he could use that as a place to start with them. It is that, but it's not just because of that. Paul reasoned with them from the Bible because it was the grounds of his own faith. He starts with the Bible because that is how God has revealed himself to humankind. He starts with the Bible because the message of the Bible itself actively appeals for us to follow Jesus if we're not yet followers. He starts with the Bible because all of the Bible speaks of Jesus and his salvation, as we're going to see in just a moment. Now, I don't want to say too much on this because John will no doubt be saying more next week as Paul goes on to the next town. I don't want to leave him with nothing to say on the matter. But this doesn't mean that we can only quote the Bible in our evangelism. It doesn't mean we can only woodenly quote Scripture. It doesn't mean we can't be creative and inventive in the ways that we try and persuade people to consider Jesus. But the substance of everything that we share has to be the substance of the Bible itself. Otherwise, we have no authority for saying anything. Anyway, you can look forward to more on this aspect next week. Our message is also about Jesus' death and resurrection. The death and resurrection of Jesus are right at the heart of our message. It's the very reason Jesus was born. It's the only means by which we could be made right with God. It's the only acceptable payment for our sin, and it's the only guarantee of a hope for a future eternity. All of this is based on the fact that Jesus died and came back to life again. If it is so central to what we believe, I wonder, could you explain it to someone who wasn't yet a Christian? Because that's what Paul is doing here, as verse 3 goes on to say, Paul was explaining and proving that the Messiah had to suffer and rise from the dead in verse 3. So for these Jews, they accepted that there would be a promised one who was to come, a Messiah, and we're going to see that in just a moment as well. But they didn't understand from the scriptures that this Messiah had to die and rise again. They hadn't seen that in the scriptures, and so Paul had to show this aspect to them. So maybe Paul pointed them to Genesis chapter 3, the third chapter in the Bible, where there was a promise of a descendant of the woman who would be bitten by a descendant of the snake in order to overcome evil. Maybe he took them to the sacrifice of Isaac, where a promised son had to lay down his life. And yet there was also the shift that happened as a ram died in his place, so that Isaac lived. Death and resurrection. Maybe in the life of Joseph, the Jews saw there that God is able to lift up the sufferer to be the saviour of the world. Maybe Paul sung with them the Psalms where King David's life was threatened almost to the brink of death, and yet God brought him back. Maybe he showed them Jonah coming out of the belly of the fish on the third day. Or the prophecy of Isaiah about the servant of the Lord who would lay down his life for the sins of the people and yet would live to see his descendants. Paul pointed out to them that Jesus must die so that the broken past that we have as human beings can be forgiven. But then Jesus must also live so that the hope-filled future of many can be secured. Then we must explain in our message that Jesus is Messiah. The expectations for Messiah were massive at the time of Jesus. And that was because it was a massive theme of the Old Testament. They were all expecting for there to be a Messiah. And yet for many Jews, this expectation had been skewed by the political situation that they were wrapped up in at the time. They were now expecting someone who would be a political leader to overthrow the human powers of the time. And that's why Paul had to show them that the Messiah's role was to suffer and die and rise again. So having explained that the Messiah must die and rise again, Paul then says that this Messiah is Jesus. Now the word Messiah is a Hebrew word which means anointed one. And in Greek it's Christ, which is why Jesus is called Christ, because he's the anointed one, the Messiah. Now, in terms of thinking this through, what does it mean to be an anointed one? Well, we may remember that during the coronation service, for those of us that happened to watch that episode on TV, the coronation service that King Charles had to go through, do you remember seeing the screens brought in, and he had to go behind the screens because the cameras weren't allowed to witness this point? It was a very sacred part of the ceremony, as they called it. And behind the screens, he was anointed with oil. And that was what designated him as king. Now, there's a lot that we might think is problematic about them doing that, about a modern-day king being anointed in such ways. We might have issues with that. But it does give us an insight into what was happening in the first half of the Bible when people were anointed. So when someone was anointed, they were anointed to be a person set apart to be someone in order to do something. So they were to be someone in order to do something. So by being anointed, the kings of the Bible were designated as God's representative on this earth. They were set apart as those chosen to be in communion with God, and as those who are to carry out God's rule on this earth. And they were to do that by leading God's people to also be in communion with God and then to follow his ways. So Jesus, as the Messiah, was God's king. He was the Lord. He was God's representative to establish God's rule and to lead his people to know God and to follow his ways. And unlike the kings of the Old Testament, if you read through the book of Kings, some of them are all right, but the vast majority of them failed every time. The vast majority of them failed very severely. And even the ones that are good weren't perfect. So even though the kings of the Old Testament would fail in this, Jesus was fully obedient even to the point of death in order to bring about God's kingdom. And when we follow Jesus, when we become Christians, we are then brought to know God. We are brought into being part of his kingdom. We have Jesus as our king. We follow him as our king and are led by him to carry out God's ways on this earth. And when we as Christians then try and persuade others, we are fulfilling God's plan through the Messiah to extend his rule outwards across the whole world, bringing God's blessing to the whole nations and calling all of the nations to follow him. That's what it means that Jesus is the Messiah. That's what we share with other people. Well, as we explain our message, we are then to expect misrepresentation. So secondly, we expect misrepresentation. Now, the time I was most misrepresented in sharing the gospel was when I was doing a Christmas talk for the schools here. Every year the primary school comes up to the building here, loads of parents in the back, and I have the privilege of sharing a message for Christmas. And I think it was my third or fourth Christmas that I was incredibly misrepresented. I was misrepresented, I'm going to say this carefully, just in case, as having denied the existence of a certain central figure to the popular Christmas story in front of all of the children. Not Jesus, I would never deny him. The one with a beard, you know, the one dressed in red. There we are. I'll say no more, just in case some of you still believe. For the record, I never even alluded to this jolly fat man with a beard. But when I encouraged children to go and hunt for presents that may or may not be hidden around the house before Christmas Day, that's what that was taken to mean. There we are, my mistake. Now, some of the parents were completely up in arms in this. I was completely oblivious on the morning. But later on, there was a message on our Facebook page, and the school got 5 phone calls of complaint about it. Now, at least that was about something rather trivial rather than the actual message of Jesus. But for Paul and Silas, the opposition begins when the Jews who don't believe in Jesus get jealous. So they get some local hoodlums from the marketplace. They stir up this riot. They storm upon Jason's house. And you can assume that Jason, like Lydia in Philippi, he's the host of the mission team, likely, and possibly the host of the newly formed church as well. So as they storm upon Jason's house, Paul and Silas have popped out to get some milk or something like that because they're not there at the house at the time, or at least they're very well hidden if they are. So they drag off Jason, they drag off a few of these new believers, they haul them before the city officials, and there they misrepresent the message that Paul and Silas have been sharing. So have a look at what they say. In the middle of verse 6, it tells us what the accusation against them is. These men who have caused trouble all over the world have now come here, and Jason has welcomed them into his house. They are all defying Caesar's decrees, saying that there is another king, one called Jesus. So have they caused trouble all over the world? Well, no, that vastly exaggerates the scope of their mission so far. They haven't gone all over the world, so it's exaggeration going on there. And they've never tried to cause trouble. They've never caused trouble themselves, but it's those who disagree with them that have caused the trouble. Paul and Silas have actually done their best not to cause trouble. And we've got to ask the question as well, are they defying Caesar's decrees? Well, kind of. This is where it gets tricky. You see, the declaration of the Romans was that Caesar is Lord. That had been established for around about 100 years by this time, that the Romans would declare Caesar is Lord. And yet the followers of Jesus are now declaring Jesus is Lord. But this wasn't some kind of political uprising. This wasn't some attempt to overthrow the emperor, to overthrow Caesar. They're not even trying to deny the place of rule over the empire that Caesar has. There's no interest in that, quite frankly. They were simply recognizing that Jesus is the true Lord, the greater Lord, the divine ruler over the entire world and universe, a greater ruler than the Roman emperor. So they've been misrepresented. And it results in Jason being on bail and Paul and Silas having to make this quick escape out of the city, and they go on to the next one. What about for us? As we explain the message of the gospel to people, in what ways might we expect misrepresentation? There are many ways that we could expect to be misrepresented these days. One very common way for us today is because of our views as we hold to the Bible on what it teaches on subjects like sexuality, gender and identity, these topics. We're misrepresented by saying that we only want to hate people or tell people that they're wrong when they identify in certain ways. But really our true message is that we're all equally sinful. It doesn't matter in what ways we have sinned. We're all equally in need of God's forgiving love. We're misrepresented as being merely a religion, merely carrying out religious traditions. And people miss the sense that what we're about is a people with a relationship with God. We're misrepresented as being backwards, old-fashioned, traditional, on the wrong side of history. Now, as we're misrepresented in those kinds of ways, it's not going to cause a riot, is it? It's not going to cause people to come to your house and put you on bail or something like that. But we can expect that there will be people, as we share the message of Jesus with them, that they will reject our message, and then either through ignorance or deliberate malice, probably more the former than the latter, they will then misrepresent us. They will misrepresent our message. They might then misrepresent us to others who know us as well. Now, why is it important that we're aware of this? It's important because if we know that this is likely and expected, then we're going to be more prepared as and when it does happen. So that's the message that Paul explains. That's the misrepresentation, if I can get my words out, that he experiences on this occasion as he tries to persuade people to believe in Jesus and follow him. But in wrapping up, I want you to notice the words that are used by Luke in describing Paul's persuasion. So have a look down at verse 2. It says, he reasoned with them. In verse 3, he explains and proves. And that's how diligent we need to be sometimes. I find the temptation that if I actually manage to get to the point of saying something about Jesus to someone, which is rare in and of itself, then someone gives me a quick fob off of, no, I don't believe that, and I just back away completely. I find that's how I tend to be. Or maybe they give me a half-hearted answer and I just stop straight away. But sometimes if we feel there's the opportunity, sometimes it's right for us to press on a bit more, to reason with them, to explain to them why the excuse they've given doesn't actually hold water, to prove to them what we know to be true about Jesus. And maybe someone says to you, I don't believe he's a real figure. Well, why not take them to the New Testament documents and show from them there how Jesus is presented as a real person and all of the evidence that lies behind that. And then they see the results. In verse 4, what does it say? Some of the Jews were persuaded and joined Paul and Silas, as did a large number of the God-fearing Greeks and quite a few prominent women. Now, isn't that what we long for? As we explain our message to people, trying to persuade them, we can be assured that some will be persuaded. It might be precious few. It might be the ones and twos over the course of years. It often is in our times. But isn't that what we want to see? People turning to Jesus, being convinced of who he really is. And maybe for you, maybe you're persuaded today that Jesus is the promised one, who died and rose again to bring us to God. If so, then you're to come to him. No matter how undeserving you feel, accept his loving kindness accept his forgiveness, and give your life over to following him, being part of his kingdom with Jesus as Lord.